Um, so this is going to be our last session. So I thought I would do something what that is both appropriate for the upcoming Zman of Tammuz and Av, but also something I think is a good reflection on time spent in yeshiva and time spent beyond yeshiva, yeshiva and what comes after it, as it were. So I call it Home-Torah and New Torah. It's all pulling from this one essay called, or drasha called Chorban Habayit V'Hitchadshut HaNeshamot, the destruction of the home and renewal of the souls. I'm going to put a link to it in this first title right here, because it actually was never published in like print. It's published on online on CIOF's website and on the Rav Shagar website. B'ezrat Hashem, my translation will be published in print at some point in the future. Yeah. All right. So I got about 2 pages of sources here. I'm not going to do all of it, but I want to give it all to you guys just in case. And also, I put the whole translated drasha in the chat, in the WhatsApp group. So the drasha talks about Chorban Habayit, right? The drasha for the 3 weeks. So Chorban Habayit, which is how we've sort of traditionally referred to the destruction of the Beit Hamikdash, right? Habayit, short for Beit Hamikdash. But in Hebrew, that also just means the destruction of the home, not the destruction of the Beit Hamikdash. And so for Rav Shagar, Chorban Habayit is, in this drasha and another drashot, it becomes expanded into the question of what it means to lose your home in general, right? When we say Chorban Habayit, we actually don't just think about the destruction of the physical Mikdash, because we actually tie it up with Galut, with the loss of our physical home as a nation. So both the linguistic aspect and the historical connection between the destruction of the Beit Hamikdash and exile expand towards this idea of like more existential sense of what does it mean to lose your home. And Rav Shagar takes it back to the first galut in the Torah, right, which is the galut of Adam Harishon from Gan Eden, and in a more intense sense, even the galut of Adam Harishon from his more like original station via the chet. So this is the sin of Adam. By sin, I do not mean the sort of gluttonous trespass which we call sin in our world. By sin, I refer to seeking independence through shattering the harmony and going in a different direction. Sin gave Adam freedom. Though he matured, left home, and leaving, he lost his home in the Garden of Eden. From that point on, he could no longer go home again. This is the fiery, ever-turning sword, which cannot be passed. Right? So the first sin for Rav Shagar is the attempt to seek independence, to what in Kabbalah and Chassidut called Ana Amloch, I will be reign, I will be king. The idea of acting based entirely on your own ability to determine truth and determine reality. Like it's in some sense, you may notice there's no reference here to the Chet Eitz Hadat. It's simply the attempt to mature in such a fashion that you are totally self-determined. Right? The idea of denying our creator, denying our past, denying our parents, right? Maturing and leaving home is something we all do. I mean, this Shagar actually goes on the essays. This is not. He starts off here calling this chet, but in some sense, it's just the nature of human beings that we grow up and we mature, we leave home. And the problem is that once you leave home, you can't ever go back again. Now, there is, in fact, a fundamental destruction of what was simply in the process of moving forward. You don't literally destroy your parents' home, but you can't ever go back to your childhood home again, right? Because for children, it's just their home, but for you, suddenly it's your childhood home. It's the home where you were. It's an entirely different experience. You can't ever go back to that again. And so that sensibility of having lost our home is a part of moving forward, is an important part of our sense here, but he's going to explain a little deeper what it means in the sort of expansion of the idea of the home. The Kabbalists explain the destruction of the temple ultimately meant the destruction of at-homeness. At-homeness is how I've translated what Rav Shagar uses called baitiyut. I mean, like homeness. I've translated it 100 different ways over time. At-homeness is a sort of jargony way of putting it, but it reflects the fact that Rav Shagar uses this term over and over again to mean this idea of feeling at home, a sense of familiarity, a sense of identity with the space. Like this is, there's some song, I can't remember what the song is, where the recurring lyric is, sometimes you want to go where everybody knows your name, right? That sense of a place where you are known, where you know what's going on, where everything makes sense to you, where you feel comfortable and you don't feel at all vulnerable, or like your own identity and what you care about is in question. Your home fits like a glove in some sense. So when we lost the Churban, we lost any sort of space like that. We would persist in other people's spaces for the rest of time, or at least in exile. This feeling disappeared, creating the fullest experience of the mourning a person carries with him his whole life. Though a person must take care that this feeling does not expand to overwhelm his life, a mourning for this lost at-homeness still rests at the foundation of every human being. It is the same with the issue of exile. Exile is a national predicament, but also personal and cosmic, each person ultimately remaining alone. The sense of discomfort that will shift from sometimes being very minor and mild to sometimes being quite dramatic, but the discomfort of being in other people's space, in a space where you don't quite fit and your priorities are not quite the same as the priorities of the space. In some sense, the sensation of being a minority figure in someone else's space is something that persists in all of our lives, right? You always share space with other people, and it doesn't have to be bad that you're stuck in a space that's not defined by you. It's a space where, the idea that you put your own concerns aside and try and imagine what other people are concerned with and what they're feeling, their experiences, and imagine their perspective, are things that are all bound up with this loss of at-homeness, the loss of feeling like, oh yeah, this is my space. So there is, in fact, almost an ethical move involved in embracing this sense of exile. And Shagar will talk about that elsewhere. There's a good essay in Luchot of Shiur Luchot called Galut B'toch Baitiyut, exile, containing exile within the feeling of being at home, where he talks more about that. But it's also important to recognize the sense of loss that comes with it. Right? We exist in a state of exile because we are never able to just pretend that we're the only thing that matters. This space is sort of totally ours. We never can feel totally at home. I assume people who still have roommates can really very strongly identify this, in the sense that roommates are people who, you learn to share space with them and create a shared space together, but very much not your space. And every now and then that becomes an issue. Source number 3, we're not going to read inside, but he, working off the Zohar and other texts, Tikkun Zohar, he talks a lot about how Churban Habayit is also, Galut Shechina. There's a sense of God is also in exile. God has also lost God's home, as it were. And so part of the, not just thinking about exile and thinking about what it means to lose your home, but in a sense, during the 3 weeks, embracing and embodying the sensation as avodat atzit, as a sort of religious act, is identifying with God and understanding that this sense of disconnect, of things not being quite where they're supposed to be, of things not working out quite right, is a deeply religious thing. So now it reflects the way God interacts with reality. So we exist in a world in a state of wandering. Our reality is a secularized reality of destruction, characterized by a deep sense of abandonment and mourning. The sense that God is exiled in the world means that this sense of abandonment and mourning, of loss, is in some sense fundamental to reality. So that's sort of the setup of the drasha. And it actually takes the body of the drasha. I've skipped a lot of really interesting stuff. He builds a family metaphor, talking about Churban and exile. All kinds. He works a lot with the Tikkun Zohar. So really interesting stuff. I do recommend reading through the whole drasha. But that's the basic picture he starts with, of that we live in a reality that is just everywhere and all the time. We are not quite in our space. We live in a space that we can't identify with fully, that often runs according to principles and priorities that are not our own. Then I want to look at now is 2 sort of solutions to this text, to this problem moving forward. Before I do that, any questions, thoughts? Let me hear him. All right, so you guys keep thinking about that. I want to look at the first thing is he says that there's one home that still remains for us, which is the Torah. And this is an important idea for Rav Shagar in general, the idea of the Torah as our home, but particularly in response to the problems of Galut. He'll bring this up again when it comes to the question of like how at home should we feel in the modern state of Israel if it's like a secular state and we're religious people, and can we find our home in the state entirely, or should we still maintain some sense of the Torah as home? But minimally, he wants to say that in a world of deep abandonment and mourning, they said, it's a world of we're always feeling a little out of place. The Torah can provide us a space, a textual space, but a space nonetheless where we can sort of feel at home. However, Tikkun Zohar teaches that, in a sense, we do have a home even when in exile. In contrast, a house full of words, filled with words of Torah, fills with a reality that transcends destruction. Torah is the last form of at-homeness, of baitiyut, that remains available to us. Anyone who learns Torah can strongly feel that on some level, the Torah enables us to escape. Life is full of confusions and disturbances, but we can still feel calm, respite in the Torah. Right? The Torah is, in some sense, a world unto itself. This is sort of the underlying thesis of the yeshiva as a model, the idea that you can sort of live in the Torah. I'm sure all of you have heard at least once a drasha about the Teva of Tevat Noach as the going into the Torah while the world outside is a mabul, and going to the yeshiva while the world outside is a mabul. Which, if you're a good, modern Orthodox religious Zionist Jew, tends to end with talking about how Hashem says to Moshe, "Tzei min hateva," you go out of the teva, go out into the world. But the basic intuition there is that the Torah can be a space where everything makes sense, because it runs according to its own logic, separate from that of the world. So within this sort of self-contained world of the Torah, there's no churban, there's no galut, because nothing is like the Torah is the Torah is the Torah. You live inside it, it makes sense, it keeps going despite anything else that might happen in the world. Its disconnect from the world is in many ways its strength, because it doesn't have to appeal to anything, to change over time. It is justified by itself. It is self-explanatory. It's entirely self-contained. God's holy house left the physical world when the temple was destroyed, but there's still one place where I can feel at home, a place where people speak words of Torah. The Torah, or in modern terminology, the text, is the Jew's home. I'm not speaking metaphorically. Though we exist in physical space, there's also mental space wherein we Jews feel sheltered, as if beneath the wings of a mother bird. This mental space is the Torah. Right? The idea that you can just spend time thinking about the Torah, and that is where you are, like what you're occupied with, and it keeps you sane on some level, keeps you from being too distracted by or consumed with ongoing events, is one thing Rav Shagar very much identifies with. It's a deep intuition running through Halachic Man by Rav Soloveitchik, but also from Adar of last year. It was a really good interview with Rav Moshe Lichtenstein in Makor Rishon, talking about the Torah study happening at Gush in the middle of the pandemic, and how he thought that we should not be trying to escape the real problems and suffering of the pandemic. The ability to have something stable, Havayot of Abaya and Rabbah, to say, like the lives and realities of the Gemara of Torah as something expansive but also disconnected from this world, is something that can grant us stability and a real space outside of our chaotic lives. So that's one answer to the problem of Churban. One answer to the problem of Churban is that we live in the Torah, that the Torah is somehow a safe space, isolated from all possibilities of change and destruction and loss, that we don't have to worry about those because we have the Torah, and that it's sort of our response to the real social and political and historical problem of exile, is that after losing our land and after losing the Beit Hamikdash, the physical space where we could encounter God, we re-find our national space, our religious space in the Torah, right? In the mental space of the Torah. We go to meet God not on the regalim in Yerushalayim at the Beit Hamikdash or in Shiloh at the Mishkan. We go to meet God when we study Torah every day in the Torah. And because it's this Torah that's non-physical, that's totally based on words, there is no possibility of galut. We cannot lose our sense of being at home unless we ourselves lose it. And in some sense is one, like I said, what yeshiva is in general, is this trying to have a physical space, right? The space of the four walls of the Beit Midrash, of the building of the yeshiva, that identifies totally with this mental space. But it's also the point of it to try and instill this mental space, right? To give people this ability to carry the Torah with them as a world unto itself, even outside yeshiva. That the one of the things that yeshivot like Araita and TVA do, these post high school yeshivot, is try and give people the ability to return to the mental space of the Torah without having to return to the physical space of the yeshiva. That you can find time for kovei team with Torah, to have fixed times learning Torah outside of the walls of the yeshiva. The ability to access this world that's somehow separate from your daily life is something that it's like a skill that yeshiva are really trying to instill. And that is sort of the first solution to the problem of Churban, is the idea of the Torah as a home, as a fixed thing, something outside of time and space and history. The next section, which we are talking about the idea of Chidushay Torah, something even more than Chidushay Torah, somehow like a really new Torah Chadashah, more than Chidushay Torah, and the idea that could present some sort of new option that's the Torah as a home, but also the Torah that's not disconnected from real life. Before we go there, any thoughts in the previous section? Yeah, Max.
It's not such a concrete thought because I'm about to reference something I'm actually not so familiar with. But I once read it was like online. It was a back cover of a book, an academic work called Broken Tablets. I don't know if you've heard of it. It was like Levinas, Derrida, and the Literary Afterlife of Religion, something like that. And it kind of chronicled the correspondence between Derrida and Levinas. And it said something about Derrida and how the question he was trying to understand was specifically from a literary perspective, the literary afterlife of religion, and understanding the Jewish question in a literary fashion, something like that. And in this place where he says the text is the Jew's home, what exactly is it just he's saying that within learning Torah we could feel at home, or is there something more there in connection to theory?
Good question. The issue of Derrida's Jewishness and how what he's really dealing with Judaism is very complicated. Not the least because he himself sort of denied that it was important for his thought, but also said he's like, I am both Jew Greek and Greek Jew, which is to say he's very Jewish in some way, but also lots of other things, and they're all mixed together. Lots books and books and books have been written on this in Hebrew and in English. But I suspect he is at some point, to some degree, yes, talking about this fact that Jews are I did feel at home in the text of the Torah, but also probably more actively focused on the idea of interpretation, and the way Jews feeling at home with the Torah has also led to just an unending interpretation of the Torah. The Torah can't be tied down as you might say as a fixed signifier, sort of theoretical terms, as something with a clear referent and meaning, because they're just Jews have always been reading and rereading the same text to mean different things. So yeah, I don't know exactly what you meant, but I assume it's something along those lines. It's obviously, I think, a much broader topic, but on some level, the capacity for reinterpreting the Torah is exactly what enables it to be our space and vice versa. The fact that we can carry the Torah with us through different contexts and generations, right? From the time of the Mishkan in Eretz Yisrael, through the times of the Beit Hamikdash, through exile, back to Israel, back into exile, and the Torah is relevant in all of those times and places, is a function of the fact that we can continue to make new drashot in whatever sense, and we continue to apply the Torah anew in each generation. And it's because of our sort of commitment to the Torah as a text that enables us to sort of have that sense of identity with it, and that a sense of freedom's not the same, but the flexible capacity of the Torah. I'm not going to go into this now, but I have a huge fan of an Agadata on Yoma Samach Tet, so the 69th daf of Yoma, about how the Anshe Knesset HaGadol got their name. Sort of an exploration of the way different Nevi'im have davened using the phrase El Gadol Gibor V'Norah, and then the way it appears in our Torah, in our davening. It's super good, and it's exactly this question. It's just a phenomenal Agadata. Yeah, sorry, I was distracted. No, I'm thinking about it. It's just super relevant to this whole topic. But I'll drop a link in the chat to the text and like a shiur I gave on it, because I gave the shiur like 2 years ago, and then I gave the same shiur again on Shavuos this year, because it's a phenomenal Agadata. I love it. Okay, so let's do this last section, the Torah of new souls. So I left this off the page because it took too much space, but what Rav Shagar is dealing with, the idea of new souls, is based on the Arizal. That the Arizal talked about how, in some sense, like almost the goal of religious activity, of yichudim, Kabbalistic activity, is to give rise to the birth of new souls into this world. Rav Shagar quotes the Arizal, and he also quotes it's interesting, Rav Yosef Avivi, who's not quite an academic, but some semi-academic scholar of the Arizal. Actually just put out 4 like massive volumes on Rav Kook's understanding of the Arizal. But he'll quote the Arizal Avivi, and also he also quotes the Gra. The Gra's understanding of the Arizal. Because the Arizal, the Gra, as Rav Shagar is going to say, shifts the emphasis from like new nishamot, new souls being born into the world, which is from that to like new Torah being born into the world. So the souls that appear in the world after the destruction are no longer new souls. Rather, are souls that act as combinations of souls that already existed and appeared in the course of history. On a deeper level, they have nothing new to say, no new perspective to offer. They are nothing more than different recycled versions of the past. So if we said that the Torah could be a home because of its stability, and the way we can sort of identify with it over time, he's pointing to here the way that becomes a problem, because that could be like the stability of the home can also be its stagnation, its like sense of having nothing new to offer to us. And that if we do live in a changing world, if we don't live just within the 4 walls of the Beit Hamikdash, then the disconnect between those two worlds can be stabilizing, but it can also be tearing in a sense. It can feel that we are pulled between the two in a way that is painful and hard to maintain. So innovating in Torah does not mean coming up with some novel idea, a chiddush, which ultimately is just a combination or rearranging of older, pre-existing elements of Torah. Right? So you must differentiate Torah chadasha and Shemot chadashot from just a chiddush in Torah. It's not just about putting old ideas, grabbing 2 different parts of Torah and putting them together in a new way. It's about something that's like entirely new. Innovating the Torah means renewing the Torah. During the time of exile, Torah functions like weeds, growing from seeds already in the ground. However, in this case, there are no new seeds. The mystical aspect, the inward or the inspirational, has disappeared from Torah, and there is no way to innovate it. All that remains is to play with or switch out the elements that are already there. In this sense, the Vilna Gaon asserts that the destruction of the temple was a destruction of the Torah. Right? One thing the Vilna Gaon says is that during the time when we had the Beit Hamikdash, there was this sort of constant flow. Working with images from the Arizal, this constant flow of Torah and divine energy into the world. And something like new Torah, not in the sense of we already have the Torah, lo b'shamayim hi, and rearranging it, but on some level about the nevuah, about like the new Torah that was not in the world, somehow suddenly emerging within the world. This is the part of the destruction that people see as metaphysical or cosmic. Just like in the time of the Tanaim and Amoraim, we lack a righteous person, a tzaddik, who would create new ideas. As such, there are no new souls. The world is arid and dry because the divine fertility has left it. Whereas the Luria views redemption as the creation of new souls, the Vilna Gaon sees it as the creation of a new Torah. Ultimately, the two are inseparable. When a truly new soul appears, he reveals and waters the new Torah, as the Vilna Gaon said. And waters here picks up on the sort of like agricultural or floral metaphor of the seeds and the weeds mentioned above. That there's this idea that suddenly the you could have someone new. And below, he's going to reference Rav Kook in another essay on sort of the rise of Chassidut in amongst the Zionist community. He says, like, maybe one day we'll have a new Baal Shem Tov, maybe not. And elsewhere he'll talk about Chassidut as this sort of new movement, this new way of thinking about Torah. So that when we have a new soul, they bring with them the ability to see Torah in new ways. And so he can reference the next piece, how he not only sees Rav Kook as this, but really sees his own students in some ways. And the like new generation is already people older than I am. His students he's looking at when he's talking about this. So certainly, people your age, people who are really, want to live in the world of Torah, who are also deeply rooted in the modern secular world. That for Rav Shagar, we're not like modern Orthodox, meaning Orthodox that happens to be modern. We are modern and we are Orthodox. We are religious and we are Zionist. That we are two things that we all have to put together in our own sort of unique way. And part of that is about navigating how we understand Torah and where Torah fits in with our lives. And not in the sense of like what part of my life is Torah and then I have the rest of my life, but assuming that I have different aspects of my life, how do they affect my understanding of Torah? And how do I like say Torah, speak Torah, teach Torah, learn Torah from within my own sort of living in multiple worlds, my own living in the world of the Torah sometimes, but also living, outside of Torah, outside of yeshiva, in whether it's university or whatever you end up doing otherwise. That idea that like you have your legs planted in multiple worlds and you hold them together, and that's like Torah is not ignorant of or separate from or abstract from your own personal attempt to put your life together from disparate pieces. Sort of the paradigm of that is in some sense the return to the land of Israel. Cook showed us the return to the land meant the end of exile. Right? If we say that Jewish people were sort of exiled from the land and found a new home in Torah, what does it mean then to have come back to the land? Because he showed us this, we were able to achieve stronger, bolder possibilities of Torah. I believe it also made it possible for new souls to sprout out, right? New people who are suddenly not living in just the one home of the Torah, but also living in Torah, and as well as in the land, living in both of them together. Today I see novelties, guys with all sorts of combinations. And Rav Shagar likes to talk about serufim chadashim, new combinations. And it's a reference to probably from Rabbi Nachman, the Kabbalistic idea of tzerufe otiot, putting letters together in either for meditative purposes or on like a mystical level. The world is made out of combinations of letters. So he says, Rav Shagar says, I see people with all sorts of different combinations, people who are themselves made up of all kinds of different like combinations of letters. I don't always understand these people. He has a piece where he talks about like hearing the music his students play and being like, it sounds like a tractor to me. I don't understand what they're doing with the music. If you were to load their program on my computer, so to speak, it would just short the circuit. Perhaps these are new souls. Let us hope that these souls help the river flow stronger and help the passionate desire return. These sort of eros of Torah and the relationship with God through Torah and the idea of the world as a site that's not simply a place of abandonment and mourning, and the world itself being a place of meaning and identity. Let us hope that the couplings in the upper worlds and Torah innovations in this one will both be fruitful and creative. The father will then bring back the mother to the home, rebuild the home, and the sons will once again find a fitting place to rest the world. Right, so the for return of God, the return of a sense of feeling at home in the world. not just in Torah. That the idea is if we recognize who we are as people who are, made up of multiple elements, made up of a variety of homes, we could one day, understand Torah in a new way, understand Torah in a way that makes Torah in a broader sense. That's not just the Torah of, the Beit Midrash, the Torah of the home while in exile, but also is a Torah that can expansively include the Beit Midrash on one hand and life outside the Beit Midrash in the other. That's sort of all I have to say on that. Any thoughts, questions?
It's just funny because it sounds so halakhic, man. All this, and you just.
Yeah, I was saying I could give a whole year-long series on the similarities and differences of Rav Shagar and Rav Soloveitchik. There's a lot of similarities, and some of that is direct influence. Rav Shagar does cite Rav Soloveitchik, but some of it's also they're both figures who lived in the yeshiva, but saw the rise of Judaism in the end of the 20th century in America and Israel. It was totally different from anything that came before it.
Yeah.
Great.
And I don't know if this is a question under Rav Shagar as much, or maybe a question we were saying, and I'm not sure if this comes from Rav Shagar or separate, but yeah, I'm not sure I necessarily agree with the idea that we are modern and we are Orthodox, we are religious and we are Zionists. I mean, maybe this is just I'm wrong, but I always saw it as we are Orthodox, we are Yer Shemayim, and part of being Yer Shemayim is it demands this, this, and this of us. It's not we are this and this, and okay, let's find the work together. It's being a Yer Shemayim demands these different things that are not, at least on the surface, holy, but really they are holy and expected of us, right?
Right. So, meaning Rav Shagar that's how Rav Shagar will articulate it, and I think that makes sense to me. He is arguing more specifically with the idea from Rav Kook that if you were truly religious, you would be Orthodox and you would be Zionist, and those things would all sort of flow out of your religiousness, and there's no contradiction between them. And Shagar is no, you can experience a contradiction between them. One thing I'm partial to is a really good letter from Rav Hutner in the Pacha Yitzchak about to, I think, a student, but someone who said I feel like I'm living a double life. And Rav Hutner has two metaphors there for images for how it's not a double life, right? He says having two homes is a double life. Having two rooms in one home is not a double life. But the other image is, he says that, it's not a double life if you have one center and everything is organized around the center, right? And the Torah is the center and sort of everything is organized around that. But I think those two images, the two rooms in one house and on the one hand, and the circle with one thing at the center and everything else existing along the outside circle are sort of different, right? For Rav Shagar's, Rav Shagar, his argument of we are religious and we are Zionist, we are modern and Orthodox works pretty well with the two rooms image, right? We have a Torah room and a academia room, a religious room and a Zionist room, and we make one life that includes both these elements, and we figure out what the relationship between them when we spend time in one, when we're in the other one, but they're part of one thing. Versus the other one, which seems to suggest that Torah is at the center and somehow Torah orients and organizes everything else in a way, unless you want to say that the Torah and Mada, religious and Zionism are all points on the outer circle. But the way I always read it was the Torah is at the center, organizing and sort of controlling the circle of everything else, which is a different image. I hope you got that. I think we've lost you. Max.
Yeah, I think that question, when Ellie asked it, kind of reminded me of Rav Shagar and Zionism, and a little bit of a response to Rav Kook. Whereas in there's kind of these two types of religious Zionism, and I think the one I grew up with was kind of the Zionism itself wasn't religious, meaning we were religious, we were also basically secular Zionists. And then when I came to Israel, I kind of learned more of the Rav Kook world. It became, no, my religion is fundamentally Zionist, meaning part and parcel of being Orthodox in a certain sense. The outlook of Geula and what that all means now impacts the way I see Eretz Yisrael. It's not just the Jews need a state like other countries, but this is part of, the development of Jewish history. And then when I learned Rav Shagar a little bit, Rav Shagar almost liked this idea of there being a separation, and this idea of, being religious and Orthodox, being religious and Zionist, and the idea of like creating space for secularism, and not that just that secularism kind of is reduced into or uplifted into Kadosh, but kind of not just seeing it all as kind of collapsing into just the Kodesh, but rather kind of being okay with the Kodesh and the whole. I don't know, that like that whole conversation kind of reminded me of that conversation in the way that plays out there.
Yeah, it's the same issue. It's the same discussion, and it's important, I think, in the sense of what do you do when you encounter something that contradicts, what you think of Kodesh, right? Is there an experience of chol that's like real and significant, where you should sort of be like denying that, and like how do you manage that? So Rav says you should accept that you've experienced something that's chol, that's like separate from Torah, and that's okay. And maybe there's this expansive sense of Torah that could contain it. The way of Cook will talk about Kodesh and Chol, and then Kodesh Elyon, and that includes Kodesh and Chol. Rav Shagar says he does affirm that idea that there's a higher Kodesh that includes what we contain Kodesh and Chol, but that's something for Yemot HaMashiach. It's not part of like our life right now. He thinks right now you should accept the real reality of Kodesh and Chol as different categories in our life.
In that model, though, does he maintain like this hierarchical model where like the Kodesh is very much like what should be almost like the living room where we spend most of our time, and like the whole, not necessarily time, but in terms of like value and the way that we construct our lives, like is the Kodesh almost like a more important room in the house? Or is he saying that like these are both like very valuable parts to the house?
So he doesn't make a super clear statement on that. It's clear what his own personal answer would be. Like he was a Rosh Yeshiva, and was like a teacher of Torah all of his life, and it's like what he cared about, what he thought everyone should be involved in. But he also believes that God puts us where in our lives, wherever we end up, for specific reasons. Like not specific reasons, but like because we're supposed to be there. So the fact that we are like so deeply enmeshed in the secular world sometimes, and it could be at the very like it's not. This doesn't tell you exactly what you should do or how you should spend your time, what you should be involved in, but there's something divine about that. So he wants us to be able to like open to the idea that God wants us to be built up at least partially from Chol as well as from Kodesh. That who we are is on some inherent level, somewhat made up from Chol as well as Kodesh. So I'm sorry, we're about to be out of time, and this is worn out. I just want to say thank you guys for a great year of shiurim. I'm happy to start a new meeting so we can finish answering your question. But just want to say thank you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rav. Really appreciate it.